Thank you, Jim, and welcome to all of you. The Makino Collection arrived at Columbia in 2007, as you've heard, and I began processing the collection in mid-September of 2008 with a few months' assistance from the previous Starr Library archivist, Michael Otakagno, and with the help of former Ritsumeikan University graduate student, and now one of our panelists today, Atsuko Oya. In a nutshell, the collection contains over 14,000 books, over 10,000 magazines, almost 2,000 file folders that look like this, sometimes labeled, sometimes not. Not archival, so we have to rehouse them. And other materials, sometimes objects, sometimes film, but not very much film. And all in all, there's 80,000 items, about 14.5 tons, over 900 linear feet. Yeah, it's big. And as those of you who are familiar with the collection are aware, it focuses on the print materials, mostly related to Japanese film that were collected over the course of 50 years by former filmmaker and film researcher, Mr. Makino Mamoru. In the 1960s and 70s, Mr. Makino worked on documentary films for several film production companies. And beginning in 1960, he started collecting materials for his research on the Proletarian Film League of Japan, or Prokino for short. And that was a left-wing film movement active in the 1920s and 30s. And he also collected materials related to it from the Toho Film Studio, where many left-wing film writers and directors worked. And he went on from there, Mr. Makino went on from there to write about other areas of Japanese film history, and in the process collected a vast array of additional materials to assist in his own writing. He later brought into his collection from purely Japanese sources to include sources from China and Taiwan and the former colony of Manchuria and South Korea, an area of which I have yet to process. Overall, Mr. Makino recognized that in order to construct film history, first it's necessary to collect documents, and in order to collect documents, one must learn the issues that preoccupy the pioneers who collect the documents, or who created the documents, excuse me. And so that philosophy drove his approach to collecting. So today I'm going to just introduce a few highlights of the collection and give you a sense of how processing works. To date, almost 30% of the boxes in the Makino collection have been processed and can be requested with my help. Processing began with the scenarios or the scripts in the collection, followed by the film production company materials, or studio materials, then director files, and then pre-war materials more generally. These items are either rare, important to the field of film studies, or ephemera potentially unique to the Makino collection. And while working on these materials, I sometimes came across materials on other subjects in the same box, and so I began processing those materials too while they were close at hand. So I've either processed or am continuing to process materials that include, among other things, censorship, pre-war and wartime film magazines, left-wing literature related to Prokino and others, amateur film magazines or small gauge film materials, which are 8mm, 9.5, and 16mm film called Kogata Eiga, some documentary film materials, film festival and exhibition materials, and photo albums, among others. The collection contains over 1,000 pre-war scenarios, screenplays or scripts, you could call them, and referred to in Japanese as kyakuhon or simply shinario. These are valuable because many are handwritten, and in some cases we have several versions of the same script. Let's see. So this one, for the film The Lifted Spear, or Dokoi Kono Yari, is one of two scenarios for films in the Makino collection that were written by the well-known director Kurosawa Akira. The Lifted Spear was never made into a film, so we have scenarios that were never made into films. And along with the scenarios, there are even related storyboards, as you see in this next slide, which depicts a scenario and a storyboard from a 1960 film. There are some notebooks with related photographs or sketches. So here's, I put them together so you could see that they look very similar. And so these sketches are for the sketch on a photograph for the film Journey to the West, which is a Japanese translation of a Chinese classic. It's undated, but it may be for the 1917 version of the film. And then here's another example of a handwritten storyboard, which is kept with the scenarios, but also has a related sketch, which is that one. So Mr. Makino acquired the scenarios for about half of the films for screenwriter and director Inoue Kintaro, who was active in the 1920s and 30s. We have 16 boxes, archival boxes of material for just the Inoue scenarios. And Mr. Makino also acquired the scenarios of the screenwriter Ikeda Tadao, who wrote scripts for directors like Ozu Yasujiro, Naruse Mikio, and others, and we have about 14 archival boxes for his materials. So in addition to scenarios, we have over 3,000 leaflets or handbills or chirashi, and they're from more than 70 different movie theaters, mostly in Tokyo, but elsewhere, and dating from the 1910s through the 1940s. Some of these handbills also include used ticket stubs, which you'll see in the top right of the slide of this handbill from 1940. And along with the handbills, we have some related scrapbooks, as you can see in this slide, for a 1948 film that includes a film screening schedule inside. That's the first page of it. So these handbills offer insight into what films were showing and when and where they were showing. Some also include summaries of the films themselves. And they are all delicate but visually interesting ephemera that we may ultimately consider for digitization, but we're still investigating digital options for parts of the collection. Some of you may be interested in the valuable documents and reports relating to major Japanese film production companies. These are mostly from Toho, or an abbreviation of Toho Eiga Kabushiki Gaishika. And it includes documents from the PCL studio, which is also an abbreviation, and JO studio. So PCL and JO merged in August of 1937 to form Toho. So we have materials from all of those parts of the production company. And to give you an idea of what has been processed, we have 22 archival boxes of Toho materials, about 160 folders, so manila folders. And, but that's just Toho. And then we have materials from Shochiku, Nikatsu, Toei, Daiei, and from independent film studios as well. The collection has the complete works and personal collections of various film critics, including Kishimatsuo, Iwasaki Akira, who were both members of the left-wing film movement, and others as well. There are many scrapbooks containing photocopies of the critics' published articles. So that's what the inside of one of our scrapbooks created by Kishimatsuo looks like. It's one of 29. And while today you may search online Japanese journal indexes for lists of film writers' publications, the main databases currently do not provide the full text of the articles, and locating libraries and archives with the underlying journals presents a challenge. So Mr. Makino's collection is useful not only because it contains many of the journals where scholarship on film was published since the 19-teens and 20s, but it also contains these scrapbook compilations of many important critic writings. Due to Mr. Makino's own special interests in documentary film, the collection contains numerous documentary-related materials dating from 1960 and on, from when he started collecting from 1960 on. So there are items related to the works of documentary filmmaker Kame Fumio, whom Mr. Makino got to know in the 1970s after he worked for him on the 1956 film It's Good to Live, or Ikite Ite Yokata, and we have a poster. So the Kame materials include posters like this one, publicity pamphlets, programs, scrapbooks, documents and scenarios and information relating to a retrospective published on Kame 10 years ago for the Yamagata International Documentary Film Festival. So anything Mr. Makino wrote for something that was published like this would be in the collection. Kame's 1939 film Fighting Soldiers, or Tatakao Heitai, was banned by Japanese authorities as a potentially anti-war film. Kame was the only Japanese film director arrested for violating the Peace Preservation Law of 1925, and he was stripped of his director's license. And the Makino Collection contains a post-war scenario that was printed for Fighting Soldiers. And we also have part of a carbon copy of a handwritten cut list for a different film by Kame, a Japanese tragedy, or Nihon no Higeki, which was censored by occupation authorities. So in addition to materials related to the film directors like Kame Fumio, there are also photographs and albums in the collection once belonging to cameramen, such as Miki Shigeru and Kikuchi Shiu, both of whom worked with Kame. So, for example, the collection contains prints of photographs taken on location for the film Fighting Soldiers, as well as Miki Shigeru's personal photo albums. These albums include Miki's work with the folklorist Yanagita Kunio on the 1939 film Tsuchi ni Ikiru, or Living by the Earth. And so we have a poster for that too. No, sorry, that's another location shot from Fighting Soldiers. And Miki turned his photos into a book with Yanagita Kunio that was called Yukiguni no Minzoku, and Mr. Makino collected the photos that were taken in Akita Prefecture for the book and the film. So the photographs in the collection complement the print materials. Perhaps of most interest to scholars, the Makino Collection also contains commercial film magazines and issues of harder to obtain minor film publications from the 1910s through the war years. Mr. Makino has made available many of these film magazines in reprint editions for which he has written the commentary. And these include magazines concerning censorship and also the proletarian film movement in Japan. And while several libraries now have reprint editions of these magazines, the Makino Collection has the originals. And our censorship and proletarian archival materials have been processed and are located in our off-site facility. So speaking of our off-site facility, let me explain how the items are processed and where they're located. Almost all of the 906 boxes in the Makino Collection were originally sent from Tokyo to our off-site facility in New Jersey, which we call RECAP. So logistically, that means I recall to Starr Library a few boxes at a time for sorting and processing. And although I visit RECAP 2 or 3 times a year to review a large portion of boxes at a time to help determine which boxes I should next request to Starr, for most of the collection, I call it to Starr to process it. And most of it will eventually be sent back off-site in archival safe boxes with a barcode so that patrons can recall them for use here in our special collections reading room during rare book hours. For now, you need my assistance to request the processed items, and you also need to contact me to access the materials that are housed here, which include the scenarios, the handbills, photo albums, Western film-related materials, and pre-war film magazines. In the future, you will be able to request archival materials without going through me by using the online finding aid. Books, except for the rare ones, will be cataloged for the special collections, the rare ones will be cataloged for the special collections, but the other film-related books will be cataloged for the regular stacks or in off-site storage, and they can be checked out of the library and recalled like all of the other books in Starr Library's holdings. Many of the pre-war books in the collection dealing with film, film theory, and the related fields may be the only copy in the US. I mentioned the finding aid, and it is in process. Once it is online, the finding aid will contain descriptions of the contents and links to all the Excel files which contain detailed information about the holdings of the archive. And it will also indicate if the materials are on site in our special collections. And if you need something now, if you contact me, I will tell you if we've been through it, and if we have the Excel files, I will share them with you, and then you can request them that way. There is a draft summary of the arrangement that Bob Himes mentioned, and that will become the finding aid, or the basis for the finding aid, and it is on our Makino Collection website. So please check periodically to see if we've posted new material about what has been processed. And I'd be happy to talk to any of you individually about how the finding aid is structured. Although the Makino Collection is not a collection of films themselves, as opposed to materials dealing with films, with the assistance of a generous recent gift, we are currently purchasing some films that may relate to the Makino Collection holdings. So for these films, in the online catalog record, you will see a note that says Makino Mamoru Collection related film. And if anyone has recommendations for purchase, please contact our Japanese librarian, Sachie Noguchi, or you can contact me as well. Emailing or calling me is currently the best way to see if we've processed materials related to your research interests. As those of you who have already used the collection know, I'm happy to review with you what we've processed, and I rely on your patience if we haven't yet processed materials of great interest to you. You may visit the Rare Book Room during Rare Book Hours to use Makino Collection archival materials that are on site, but please contact me in advance in case the items need to be recalled from off-site, and that takes at least a day. As I hope this brief tour of the Makino Collection has shown, the collection has thousands of materials useful for film studies and historical research, and we welcome your visits in the future. If you have any questions, please find me after the symposium or contact me through email.